Well, good morning, everybody. It's 10 a.m. Welcome to How to Be a Connoisseur Part 2. Today, jewelry and timepieces. We're looking forward to this program. There's just a wealth of information and some very, very rich discussion about to take place. So stay with us if you would. A couple of quick housekeeping items, as we always do with these programs. We've muted all of your sound and video. We try to do that at the central source. Every now and then, some smart person manages to get through and pops up on screen. If you see yourself on screen, just hit the mute button so we can take you off. The only three beautiful faces you should see on the screen today were two beautiful faces and one not so, our two presenters and myself. There is a Q&A button down the bottom. You'll see it there. It's actually the chat button. Feel free to pop questions in as we're talking. So we're monitoring them as we talk. And if I see a relevant question, I'll throw that to the panelists as we're talking. So feel free to use that chat button at will. And finally, I would remind you that this program today is being recorded. It'll sometime late this afternoon or early this evening, we'll send you out a Zoom link to the recording. So if you have to leave it at any point or you lost it or whatever the case may be, we've got a recording for you. So why today's program? This is the second in the series of how to become a connoisseur. It's really a core curriculum. We've got 4 more to come, by the way. We have a program on the home coming up on June the 9th, and then we'll be following that with 3 final programs during the balance of the year on art, food and wine, and travel, and then that will complete our 6-part series. And as always, our intent is to better equip luxury marketers, yourself, with a fundamental understanding of connoisseurship and how to convey its meaning and importance to your clients and to your customers. And today we're very fortunate to talk to and converse with 2 very, very well-experienced professionals and actually luminaries in this business. Tom Carroll, who's a highly respected and exceptionally experienced luxury retailer whose careers includes store management responsibilities for Tiffany, Louis Vuitton and Tourneau, and James D. Malcolmson, who has been covering the Swiss watch industry as a journalist for over 20 years, primarily with the Robb Report. Gentlemen, James and Tom, welcome to the program, and it's a delight to have you. Let's start at our traditional 30,000 feet, and then we'll get into the granular stuff pretty quickly. I guess my opening question to both of you, and Tom, I'll ask you to kick it off. How do you define connoisseurship? But how would you profile a connoisseur? And I understand this is anecdotal. I'm not asking for research data, but just give me your soundings on that notion.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this program with James. James, it's great to meet you. I look forward to our time together. For me, Alf, it's really a spectrum. So, my whole career is servicing the connoisseur, if you will, or the person that's aspiring to become a connoisseur. Perhaps help them curate a collection, et cetera, et cetera. So, on one hand, you want to be a trusted advisor, if you will, and someone that helps them follow their passion. On the other hand, I think you want to be a resource to bring in some additional resources, some additional experts to speak to the client's passions, if you will. So if somebody's a connoisseur or believes they're a budding connoisseur of timepieces or fine jewelry, then perhaps you bring an expert in from one of the highly regarded brands because of your relationship, or a gemologist, an expert on fancy colored diamonds, if you will.
But Tom, my question still is, how do you know when you're dealing with one? The side of the counter, how do you say to yourself, aha, I've got a true connoisseur here? What are the signs and the signals? What's the dog whistle?
Well, I think it's very easy when the client starts going down a discussion and, for example, citing reference numbers from Patek Philippe timepieces, or talking about special fancy on them. then I think it's a clear indication that, as we all know, consumers do so much research before they consider a significant purchase, and they're really focused in on the specific thing that they want to buy, if you will. Whereas we, as people who are servicing them, really are responsible for understanding a broad range of things, right?
Gotcha.
So, you're in a very interesting situation, I think, where you might have a broad range of expertise, yet this individual is really honing in on a specific passion or desire. And, then it's tough because sometimes they do know more than you do, in trying to service, or certainly they think they know more than you do because you're because they're a budding connoisseur. So, trying to correct some information that maybe they have, or trying to deal with somebody who's trying to position against your company or your brand, overcoming it's just a very fascinating and interesting and long-range conversation that has to be very carefully managed.
James, same question to you. How do you know when you're dealing with a connoisseur?
Well,
And then,
I define.
go ahead.
Please. Well, anyway, Alf, I'd like to thank you for having me, first of all, here. It's nice to meet you as well, Tom. So I define connoisseurship as an intellectual appreciation of a specific piece. We deal in an emotional business. The reason people buy jewelry and watches is mostly emotion. Either it's jewelry for a loved one, or for a special occasion, or a watch because we covet it. But one quickly understands when we're dealing with a connoisseur by the level of knowledge that they exhibit. Watch collecting in particular is a game of knowledge. And if you get two collectors together, you can immediately see them size one another up. And there's the one-upmanship in knowledge that they'll display. And they'll talk about timepieces endlessly. The more experienced they are, the more they know, and it actually gets a little competitive. So that's sort of a very interesting aspect of the trade.
Just a quick aside, I was talking to a whiskey expert this week who represents one of the top brands, Scottish whiskey brands in the world. He said, I know everything about the product. I can tell you, everything about Scotland and the distillery. He said, but the connoisseur collector knows how many pieces or how many bottles of that rare Alexander III are on the shelf in whatever country. That they know it to that degree of specificity. I think that's what you were alluding to as well, Tom. Correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Gentlemen, can you? How do you acquire connoisseurship? Can you teach it? Does it come out of a book? Do you acquire it over time? How do you get to the point where you can brand yourself a connoisseur? Start with you, James.
Well, I think most of my experience in the area is in watches, and it's a matter of scholarship. There are many, many books written. There's magazines, magazine articles all over the place about watches, full of brand knowledge. And then, of course, there are people you can talk to at retail. Some of the intrepid collectors will go to Switzerland and meet the watchmakers. It's really about educating yourself, and it's absolutely amazing how much education some of these collectors today have done. Today, they can step into, say, the vintage watch market, which requires very specific information, and they come armed with knowledge, what they think a piece is worth, and you never used to see this.
And they're acquiring that information where, James? Is it primarily the internet? Is it their own?
Books, magazines, and particularly the internet. The internet has really been transformative in terms of the amount of information at your fingertips. There's a lot out there.
Tom, same question to you again then. What's the process of acquiring connoisseurship? How do they do it? They don't wake up one day with connoisseurship in their DNA.
No, I would agree, they don't. And I would add to what James has already said by saying, trying to develop a network. And while there's this one-upmanship that was alluded to earlier, there's also a testing going on, I think, where if you're seeing two people speaking about their passion. And again, it's an emotional thing. So it's a really interesting combination, just like craftsmanship and jewelry and craftsmanship and a timepiece. It's an interesting balance between art and science, if you will. And I think that's true with a connoisseur. So it's, you know, there's the basic knowledge, there's the specific knowledge that you alluded to earlier in terms of the number of bottles on the shelf in a certain country. But there's also room for passion. There's also room to express personal preferences. So there's a little bit of vetting process going on. But once the three of us, if we're interested in timepieces, once we've established our credibility amongst ourselves, you know, there's a sharing of knowledge that I think takes place that helps extend the passion, if you will, for the piece. Not to the extent that I'm going to tell you how to get access to the piece, because I want the piece and only one of us can have it. So I'm not going to share with you and James how to get the piece, but, you know, specific information and again, the passion of it. I just think it takes what you learn from the internet, what you learn from the magazines, what you learn from the special experiences and visits to Switzerland or the ateliers and across Europe or even in New York City. You know, I just think it adds a richness to it.
Let me just stay with this for 30 seconds more, because it's important. We've got a lot of people on the call this morning who are dealing with people on the other side of the desk. And what I'm looking for is that indication that maybe something in the bit of the stuff, but something that tells you I've got a connoisseur here. I don't mean this in the wrong. I'm a good old solid middle class boy. I don't have a lot of money, but I see a lot of people who have a lot of money and they have no class and they have no appreciation of good things, of fine things. They're not connoisseurs. They've got a ton of money. I would put Elon Musk, quite frankly, in that category. I don't think he's a connoisseur. What are you looking for? That person comes across your desk. Tom, you may be selling them a very expensive timepiece. James, you may be interviewing them for an article. What alerts you to the fact that, aha, I'm dealing with a guy or a lady here who really is a connoisseur who knows what he or she is talking about? James, what's the signal for you?
Well, it's really the discussion, the level of knowledge they exhibit in the discussion, and also it's what they're interested in. I think that is a huge teller. There's been a market effect with social media on what people's preferences in watches have become. Because of social media, because of crazy valuations, there are a select number of timepieces that have really exploded in popularity and have become very, very difficult to get. Those are the kinds of pieces where somebody who's not necessarily educated in watches will gravitate. Somebody who is educated will look at the other brands. What else is there? Because of this aspect of craftsmanship or that aspect of design or mechanics, they'll appreciate the knowledge of the craft and display that. And that tells you right away that you're dealing with somebody who's not a sheep.
And Patek has that problem right now, because I believe that's become a very prominent brand now with the hip hop community and the celebrity community. The majority of whom I would not consider connoisseurs, would I?
No, I don't. I think the majority probably are not connoisseurs, as they're new to the game and they're buying what other people perceive as popular or is validated by other people. I think Patek has struggled with this for years and years and years. But of course, it's a double-edged sword, because those exploding valuations are good for them in many ways. But they also try and deal with some of the established collectors. A lot of the complicated pieces they make, for instance, are reserved for established collectors, people who have a purchasing history.
Gotcha. Tom, briefly, again, what are the signs and signals in your gut about if you're touching a connoisseur?
Sure. For me, it's the exchange, the conversation back and forth. To me, one of the key indicators is what I'm going to characterize as a lack of arrogance on their part. So I think it's, passion for the right reasons, the things that James alluded to, not necessarily a passion for collecting for something that they can have that nobody else has and they want to be able to show off, but just because there's a humbleness, these are really powerful people that are making these decisions and putting these collections together, but they're humble about it and there's no arrogance about it. There's just an inner peace, kind of an inner satisfaction. I don't know if that answers it, but to me, that's a real kind of a gut reaction.
Final question. I want to get very specifically into timepieces right now, but before I do that, James, to you, outside of the timepiece community and the world of timepiece brands, timepieces, what are the brands that to you represent true connoisseurship? And are there individuals who you would think of and say, yes, he or she is a connoisseur? And before you do that, I'll just give you some of the names I put down. I had Hermes, I had Goyard, I had Bentley, perhaps. Within that non-timepiece or jewelry framework, what are the brands that to you automatically signify connoisseurship, and people as well, if you have any?
Yes, I would agree with you in those brands, Hermes in particular, because there's so much content in the things that they make, artisanal content. They really value the artisan. I would also look to, I guess, Rolls-Royce to a certain extent, although a lot of what they do has become very modernized. But certainly the vintage cars from that brand, and Bentley, of course, as you mentioned, are very important. I think those are great examples. And somebody who'd be a connoisseur. I hesitate to mention public figures, but there are people inside the luxury industry, strictly Bernard Arnault, for instance, strictly because of their exposure and access to all these things, have become really significant in figures in luxury in general.
Certainly some couture designers as well while we're playing in that field.
Certainly, they're people, they're restaurateurs. When you play in a luxury field, you tend to broaden out and appreciate other things too.
Tom, same question to you. Brands, individuals.
Well, I think when I answer this question, I'm thinking about the brands that are not only timely, not only timeless, but also timely. I spent some time at Louis Vuitton working for Mr. Arnault's companies, and here Michael Burke, so highly regarded, but to hear him speak about becoming not keeping all those things, the craftsmanship in place that have made them timeless, but finding a way to be timely, because there is no future if you don't start, being attractive to the millennials, being attractive to all demographics, and not just, what somebody's opinion of a connoisseur might be. So I think Louis Vuitton, I think Hermes absolutely do that very well. And first and foremost, they're interested in full price retailing. So there's no, there's no markdowns, there's no outlets, etc. And they're very, very thoughtful about how they run the business. You may not agree with them in terms of a consumer if you're trying to get hold of something in particular, but you have to admire their passion for the business and the decisions they're making.
James, let's go to you. I want to nail this internet issue. And you and I had spoken a little bit briefly earlier. Your feeling was the internet had made a massive contribution, or had affected a major change in the collectibles market, particularly timepieces. What did you mean by that? And give me some meat around those bones.
Well, first of all, I would say that the internet has had a massive effect on collector psychology. when I started in watches, collectors were very, very private individuals. Watch collecting was almost a guilty shame, if you will, that people would spend so much money on these very small items, even though they're very rich in detail. People didn't understand, and the collectors thought that there was a little bit of embarrassment there. With the internet, we have the introduction of community. And like so many different movements across social spheres, community brings empowerment. And all of a sudden, collectors started getting to know one another. They started forming groups with regular meetings. So it became a clubby thing. Before you know it, the collectors were doing a lot of the journalistic work that I used to do. It's very, very different. And now, people want to be known as collectors. That's a sea change from what occurred before. And we were mentioning now is the table going to turn again? Because now that collectors are so well known and have become so open about their purchases and wearing these pieces, thieves have come out, and they know what a Richard Mille looks like, and they will follow people home in Los Angeles. It's been written.
Is it that serious a problem, security?
It's getting attention that it never used to get, and Richard Mille in particular. Richard Mille is sort of a modern brand, not very old at all, but it's become sort of a secret handshake, if you will, among the ultra rich, and that's made it popular in its own right among a certain set who want to be seen that way. And thieves have gotten to know what these watches look like. Sometimes I've heard that even in the Richard Mille boutique, they will give their customers information about where not to wear the pieces, and it's a real thing.
When you say the internet, you're talking. Are you talking the traditional platforms, social media, obviously websites? Are they on Facebook communities? I mean, internet how?
There are a few on Facebook and social media, the conventional social media that we know. Really, the watch enthusiast involvement on the internet began with these fora. There are sites like Time Zone, in which collectors could come on and speak to one another in basically email format, and meet one another and have discussions on a chat. Then there were journalistic sites. Houdinki, I think, is the most prominent one. And that's become a great source of information for a lot of collectors. And then the online presence has morphed into a real community group presence that also have online components. There's a group called Red Bar, which is in several cities, of collectors. They meet in public places, they bring their watches, and it's sort of a get together.
Tom, anything to add to this on the subject of the impact of the internet?
I would add that certainly my time at Tourneau, we wanted, people like Red Bar to come into our new store to kind of validate us, or these are the type of groups, legitimate groups that you would look for with a brand new store opening, just to kind of get the word of mouth out there about doing something differently. The other thing I would add to comments that have already been made is that, the celebrity endorsement thing is really kind of a fascinating thing, because kind of was really prominent for a while, then it wasn't. And now there are brands that are very carefully, looking for brand ambassadors to reflect their value proposition and all of that. I would add a component to this discussion more along the idea of a board of advisors. So we all have people in our lives that we value our relationships, we value their opinions, value their support. And there's an element out there, I think, in the watch and jewelry world, but particularly in the watch world, where, there's really appreciation for the fact that somebody else is validating your opinion. but it's a tight group. It's not, it's something, it's a subset of Red Bar as an example.
Gotcha. Gentlemen, let me throw out some brand names because I'd like to try to root this in some degree of reality. These are brands that I would consider, and it's jewelry and timepieces that sort of have a sort of a reputational preeminence to one degree or another. Van Cleef, De Beers, Harry Winston, Tiffany, Cartier, Rolex, Patek, Jaeger LeCoultre, Audemars Piguet, Baume & Mercier. I gave you a sort of a litany of brands there. James, pick one of those that says to you, this is a brand that understands connoisseurship in terms of how it operates, markets, brands, and operates its culture. And I'm going to ask the same question of you, Tom.
Well, I think of the brands you mentioned, the obvious go-to in watches is Patek Philippe. They are the most highly regarded of all the watch brands. Although some of the others on your list, particularly Jaeger LeCoultre, also have very storied histories, very impressive technical capacities, and are not appreciated at the same level. So you can do a deep dive in a lot of these companies and you'll see an enormous amount of content, which may or may not result in these fabulous valuations that we've been talking about.
How did Patek get there?
Well, it's very interesting. So the whole watch industry nearly collapsed completely in the 1970s with the advent of the quartz watch. All of a sudden, the Japanese and some of the Swiss could make watches that were much more accurate and much cheaper. And a lot of the big watch companies closed their doors, went out of business. Some of them started making quartz watches themselves. Patek Philippe, however, maintained the course of the mechanical watch, believing that it would come back eventually. They redoubled their efforts in innovating on the mechanical side, and the consistency there. And that period prior, they had been probably the most recognized manufacturer of complicated timepieces. But the consistency brought them, when the watch industry came back in the 1980s, it brought them to a much higher level, really, than they'd ever enjoyed before.
Tom, same question out of that list. And by the way, there may be other brands outside of this list, but certainly within this list, who stands out as having captured the essence of connoisseurship?
I'd like to kind of answer the question from a different perspective. Of like, I heard you mention De Beers, and I also think about Graf. And these are two organizations that really grew up in the jewelry side on the supply side, if you will, right? Providing diamonds, colorless diamonds on De Beers, and yellow diamonds, I guess, would be the most prominent thing that Graf was known for. They both made a decision, and De Beers really kind of forced the issue, but they both made a decision to go into the store side, if you will, the customer-facing side. I would say that Graf has been very successful doing it, and I would say that De Beers has really been challenged by it, and so to me that suggests that De Beers knew a lot about marketing, knew a lot about supply chain, knew a lot about helping that part of the industry and having a halo effect on everything within the diamond world. Yet when they stepped out of their lane and tried to do something that they thought they had expertise in, but they really didn't.
So what did Graf do well?
Well, I think what Graf did well is they took a slower approach. They took a very, very high touch approach. They went for a niche, at a certain price point and above a certain price point. And they stayed very much within, what James alluded to earlier in terms of the respectful hush-hush kind of quiet business. if that makes sense. I think De Beers made a took a much splashier approach, and it didn't work for them. I think Graf had a very clear appreciation for who they are and who they wanted to be. And I think that they understood that they had to go where they went because they were being forced into it. And they perhaps it was great instincts, perhaps it was great intel, probably a combination of both.
Just to support your contention, I visited a home that had just been listed in Pacific Heights, $40 million, stunning property, and tucked beautifully and quietly into a corner in one of the little rooms of the home was the Graf exhibit that had been brought in specifically for viewing that evening. I thought they did a very, very nice job. Gentlemen, I'd like to, we run through time so quickly. I want to profile the high-end timepiece customer, if I could. I want you to tell me about age, and I do want to talk about sex, because we always, this may be a shibboleth on my part, but I tend to think that only men collect these things. I know that's not true. So let's talk about age, sex, wealth. I think that's important. And then this notion of why do they do it? Is it asset appreciation? Is it generational pass along? What's the motivation? So age, sex, wealth status, and motivation. James, start with you.
Well, that's a lot to grab onto. Let me start by saying that here in the San Francisco Bay Area, the most significant watch collector I know happens to be female, and she only collects men's watches, partially because they happen to be the more interesting that are made. But I think right now we are in a period where, in terms of age at least, you can't put a specific demographic on it, because we have millennials collecting watches. We have Gen Xers collecting watches. Of course, the baby boomers did it for a long period. They are probably starting to fade out of their watch collecting phase. It used to be, one used to notice that there was sort of an arc in the path of a collector. They'd start out with their first couple of watches, and then they'd grow an interest either in a specific area, like a complicated timepiece, or a specific brand. And then as they matured, they began to look at vintage watches or specific, some of the top specific brands, in part because they realized late in their career that many of the watches they had purchased previously were not holding their value. And then they taper off. With the internet, the collectors have really jump-started all the way to that mature phase. They're looking for things that hold value, and investment has become a hugely important aspect for them. But they're really all kinds of ages.
My bias had been that watch collecting was still primarily a sort of an old white-haired white guy's pastime. Is that
absolutely
gone?
No, that's gone. That's gone. They're young, they're hip, they're all around you.
So talk about females for a moment. Give me the profile of the female who's collecting, if there is one.
They all, at least for my money, they're all very individual. I think you won't find a female who has a follower psychology in watch collecting. These are mostly maverick type individuals who see something that they're interested in and gravitate toward it, and they're not afraid of it. So that's the psychology. On the men's side, there are many different psychologies. There's the follower who only goes to traditional brands. They're more maverick collectors who will delve into riskier areas like independent watchmakers. And then there's very specific interests, people who are driven to a certain aspect of the craft because there are things in it that really fire them up.
Tom, same question to you. Again, the profiling based on age, sex, wealth status, and motivation. What is it for you in your mind?
In my mind, I would tell you a quick story. I moved to the Bay Area from Atlanta, Georgia, and there are a lot of strong, powerful women in Atlanta, Georgia that I got a chance to meet over a 15-year period. who ran their own businesses, who were buying their own luxury cars, et cetera, et cetera. But there was something just a little bit off about them purchasing their own fine jewelry or fine timepieces, because they believe that that was something that a guy should be given to, a man should be giving them. I moved to San Francisco 15 years ago, and there is an amazing population in the Bay Area of strong, powerful women that don't need no stinking man to do anything for them, and I would agree with everything James said in terms of a generational thing. I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had with women who connected with their dad over a timepiece. And while they may have a very extensive collection, the most valuable piece in there is their dad's watch. So it's not, the dad's watch is not going to the brother anymore. It's going to the person that appreciates it the most. And again, I would say it's equal parts for the true connoisseur. It's equal parts fantastic knowledge and passion. So the other thing I would say, absolutely not an age thing. The death of the Swiss timepiece industry has been predicted for decades now. And I will tell you that my experience in the Bay Area, some of our most important clients were from the tech world. And for somebody that supposedly wouldn't be interested in that, there's a true appreciation for the craftsmanship involved. And there were many, many collectors in the tech industry, some for the wrong reason in terms of being followers that James alluded to, but again, a real passion. From a wealth standpoint, I think there is an element of timepieces, my experience, where people will, for example, customers that will collect American timepieces, so they're looking for older Hamiltons or whatnot that, aren't necessarily available anymore, but that's what they collect, or even appreciation for Shinola and pieces like that. So they've developed a niche that they can afford to collect in. So I think there's an element of that. It's a small part, but I think there's an element of that. And from a wealth standpoint, there is an element that a certain amount of wealth is needed, I think, to be a true collector.
Staying with you, Tom, and James, I want you to circle back on this one as well. The subject of asset appreciation, the secondary market.
Mhm.
I mean, if you remember, the old Patek positioning was, you don't own the watch, you're just passing it on from generation to generation. Let's throw that aside for a moment. To what extent are they buying as a way of investing money and knowing that they can get the payout on that investment 5-10 years down the road? Is that a primary strategy now for collectibles and for timepieces?
Well, yes, it's a predominant strategy. I don't know if I'd call those people connoisseurs. I might call them investors instead. Very knowledgeable in terms of making a quality investment, if you will, but not in terms, to me, to be a connoisseur.
They're not passionate about the product.
Yeah, they're passionate about making money. They're not necessarily passionate about collecting the pieces, and this is a way for them to make money. And there are certain retailers out there that are playing to this. Talking about how, I think James and I talked about this on a private conversation earlier. James would know better than I, but the Audemars Piguets out there. There are timepieces that have appreciated far more than real estate, as crazy as that sounds right now. It's a lot more portable. It's a lot easier to deal with. So there's absolutely an element of that, but I'm not sure I would call them a connoisseur.
James, quickly, you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, sure. A company like Patek Philippe has always had sort of that duality in their customer base. They're very passionate collectors. And there are also people who buy the watches and keep them in the box without opening it in the safe. And that's strictly for investment purposes. With the advent of the internet, valuations in watches are now easily seen. At first, it was a company called Joma Shop, and you could see if your brand was discounted on Joma Shop very easily. Now on Chrono24, which is one of the dominant sites out there for resale, you can see how much certain pieces have appreciated, and that's led to the phenomenon of the unicorn watch. Certain pieces from certain brands, and there are still only a handful of them out there. I'm talking about the Nautilus from Patek Philippe, the Jumbo Royal Oak from Audemars Piguet, all the steel watches from Rolex, the Chronomètre Bleu from FP Journe, things like that, and certain Richard Mille models that have exploded in value. The Patek Philippe Nautilus has outperformed the S&P 500 by a factor of 3 over the last 5 years. It's unbelievable.
Let's stay with the tawdry notion of money for just a moment. For the collector coming into the marketplace, forget age, societal background, just they're coming in, they want to get into the timepiece collectibles marketplace. And not just to make money. They want to acquire connoisseurship. What's the entry level brand, and more importantly, what's the entry level price point? James?
I think you can get involved in a watch that has, I wouldn't say collector value, because that implies a financial potential, but you can get something that's respectable on a watchmaking level for under $5,000. I'm thinking like a brand like Nomos that makes their own movements. It's a German brand. It's very Bauhaus in its aesthetic, but it's well respected. And
how is that spelled, James? How do you spell that?
Nomos.
Thank you.
And it's a very well respected brand. So you can get watches that will interest you for not a lot of money, or certain vintage watches that are overlooked. It's easy to find something to find a place to sell.
But traditionally, if they're coming in through the traditional luxury brands, where do they come in at? Is it a lower end Rolex? Is it a $20,000, whatever the case may be? Tom, do you want to add to this?
Well, I think one of the things that a connoisseur or a collector has to do is to find their passion, find what they want to collect. You know, it can be a very broad conversation, but it should, I think, to avoid the lifetime of a collector that James went through a little bit earlier. If you decide what you want to collect and stay passionate about it, whether it's complication or whether it's a brand, that gives you a focus that I think is important. From entry level, price point, it's very easy to sink a lot of money into these things. It's whether we're talking about wine or food experiences, or certainly real estate or cars, it's very easy to get into a lot of money, and that can be extremely frustrating.
Let me ask you a question. A lot of money. I want you to be anecdotal, and James, it's going to be the same to you. Start with you, Tom. Give me the detail. Don't mention the person, and I don't need to know the lineup of the collection, but give me an example of a very robust collection in terms of its value and its size and its dimension, where you've come across a collector and you've said to yourself, wow, this person really has put together a great collection here.
Yeah.
What's it been worth?
Well, I can think of several clients. A couple of people come to mind, and they decided early what they wanted to collect. I'm thinking of one client that decided he wanted to collect Tiffany Rolexes, and Rolex timepieces with Tiffany on the dial haven't been available for, I don't know, James, 40 years maybe. So he wanted to collect that, and he wanted to collect Patek Philippe. Now, later on, he might have branched out into when he started enjoying some success, and branched out into another brand as well. But
what was the size of that collection? How many watches were in that collection? What did you estimate the value of that collection was at its peak?
There were, well, again, this is kind of a private person, so I don't know. I knew of at least 200 watches, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were more. I've seen a collection of Patek Philippe's that would just absolutely blow my mind. And they were acquired at retail, they were acquired at auction, but sometimes they decided to sell something, and that creates a whole nother problem because the brand found out about it. So, and it wasn't necessarily cared for the best way. We brought in a security deposit box, and we're going through, so it was, things like that. The brand sometimes will share stories with you. And, there's a story out there about a collector who only collects one brand that has, hundreds of them, all strap watches. And once a year, he has somebody come in and change the straps from black to brown as a seasonal change. And then 6 months later, they're changed again. They've had a special piece of furniture built for the collection. That's actually a safe. So you walk into the room, you have no idea what you're walking into. All of a sudden, a button is pushed, and the collection comes out of the piece of furniture, and there you have it. So talking about the valuations that James just mentioned, I mean, what I thought it was worth 5 years ago and what it could be worth today is just mind-boggling. It changes every day.
To that point, I had a note here that Christie's auctioned off 128 pieces of Patek from a private collection, I believe, in Southeast Asia recently. James, running out of time here, but same question to you. What dimension around a collection that you've seen that's impressed you in your years in the business?
Yeah, I've been into Aladdin's cave a few times, and that is really what it's like. I mean, as a journalist, I spent almost 20 years writing for the Robb Report, covering the most expensive timepieces every year that would come out. One time I saw a collection that had almost every single one of those watches, my career in journalism, shown to me in boxes. That was amazing. Including examples from one brand of every reference they ever made. So yeah, this is in the tens of millions of dollars in terms of valuation in some of these collections. It's probably more today for some of these. It's unbelievable how deeply people will go into this and how passionate they are and how much they'll spend.
James, personal question to you. If there was one watch you wanted to own, it would be what? For your collection, not for your wrist.
I am not interested in financial gain. For me, it would probably be the product of an independent watchmaker, maybe a Kari Voutilainen or a Philippe Dufour. These people sort of, for me at least, embody the real spirit of the Swiss craft, and that's the bee's knees for me.
And briefly, Tom, from you, give me what would your ideal be?
I guess I would answer that with two answers. First, I have my grandfather's Bulova watch. That's worth nothing on the market, everything to me. And I have an Aquanaut, a steel Aquanaut that I never thought I would own, but I've had it for a long time. It's a quartz movement, and I distinctly remember when I got it, and it's important to me that way, and I hope my grandson will have it someday.
Gentlemen, we're at the 10-minute mark here, and I've got a lot of stuff I want to cover, so I'm going to move quickly, very quickly. James, to you. The newer brands, Shinola is certainly one that comes to mind. To what extent have they had an impact upon the collector market? Have they degraded it? Have they improved it? Or have they been inconsequential?
Well, they're all levels of new brands. Shinola is one that is not really impacting the high end of the market, at least. They found their own customer base. It's not people are looking for something different.
Then go high end. I didn't know the brands to select, quite frankly. Go high end.
Well, no. In the high end, you have somebody like Richard Mille. Now, Richard Mille is a company who founded himself on he's a marketing genius, and he created a watch that had a real modern sort of high performance race car aesthetic. But he was brilliant in the way he presented it. He made it extremely expensive. And as I mentioned before, it became through design sort of a secret symbol of the ultra rich, which makes it just absolute fodder for nouveau riche.
It's a secret handshake.
Exactly. And that brand has become extremely expensive. It was their first watch came out in 2001, I believe. And I think their sales are number 5 on the list now.
Price point?
Price point used to start at around $120,000, but now most of them have appreciated far beyond retail. And we're talking $500,000 to well over $1 million. And
the appreciation is not because of the intrinsics of the product itself, but it's the perception that's driven
it's supply and demand. Yeah, mechanically, these watches are very interesting, but the componentry is not too different. For instance, the chronograph, best-selling chronograph, is not too different than what you'd find in an Audemars Piguet. But it's because there's so many people who want these pieces, and they're relatively few made. The prices have just exploded, which of course increases the frenzy.
And to that point, Rolex, my note says that Rolex produces about 1 million a year, timepieces a year. If in fact that's correct, how do they maintain their elevated price structure?
Again, it's supply and demand. It's Rolex is one of the best mass produced products in the world, if not the best. Wonderful level of quality. And right now, for the last 5 years, they've been having a moment because their watches are utilitarian. They are sporty, all these things people want. And because they have a few products that they've always limited, such as their steel Daytonas, and now a lot of the basic steel, what they call the tool watch. Those get a lot of attention. They're impossible to get, and that brings the whole brand up.
And in fact, there's a movement towards steel, certainly with the younger demographic. They want steel as distinct from gold or platinum or the more rare metals, correct?
Well, I think everybody, what's operating here is everybody wants youth. So even if you're somebody our age, we want to look sporty. We want a steel sports watch, and those, like the Nautilus, like the Royal Oak from Audemars Piguet, those are the watches that are in demand.
Tom, time. 2 important questions, going to bump them into one. Sort of societal impacts. Number 1, digital. I see a lot of people now wearing Apple watches. Yep. So the movement away from the traditional analog timepiece to that digital watch. And with that, the whole notion of dressing down. I noticed that you're a cultivated gentleman. You have a jacket on today. Neither James nor I wear jackets. I don't wear one anymore. So the dressing down and then the move to digital timepieces, how has that affected the notion of collectability in the timepiece industry?
Well, let me say I left San Francisco in August of last year, and I think this is the 3rd time I've worn a jacket since then, and I refused to put a tie on. So there you have it. Yeah, I think it's what James saying. Not only is it a young thing, but you want to feel young regardless of what your chronological age is. you know, the Apple Watch is the best-selling timepiece in the world in terms of the number of units worn. And I wear one just because I'm obsessed with closing my circles every day to make sure I get some exercise anyway. But, you know, it has not led to the demise of the Swiss industry as people
That's what I
say.
want to know.
You know,
It hasn't.
It hasn't. And, you know, and I will hark back to something James said earlier. There's a quiet elegance associated with a fine Swiss timepiece kind of peeking out from underneath your shirt sleeve while you're wearing jeans and an open neck. So, you know, I would say the digital world overall has enhanced it for all the reasons we've already talked about. And it will complement it, but it will never replace it.
I'm getting a couple of questions here, gentlemen, on Cartier. It hasn't come up in the conversation at all today. Is that a declining brand in terms of reputation or perception?
I would say quite the opposite. My experience,
Please.
Cartier was a very important brand for Tourneau. It's very tightly distributed. I think there's something like 100 points of distribution in North America for the Cartier brand, half of which they own. They're one of the oldest brands. I would check with James, but I'm sure they're in the top 5 in terms of volume. They've done a great job, I think, gone into their archives and brought back, you know, pieces like the Crash and things like that. Santos was a very successful launch for them. And then, in fact, the global launch was in San Francisco. So, you know, I think particularly in the Bay Area has done quite well. The other thing I would say is that brand, I think, has done a terrific job in terms of reaching to the female self-purchaser. The bracelets are absolutely exquisite, and it's like wearing a piece of jewelry that happens to tell time, although it's a very, very robust watch brand with a terrific mechanisms.
James, anything to add on Cartier?
I'd add also on the vintage jewelry side, I think there's probably no better regarded name in terms of, you know, if you're looking for signed pieces that hold their value, you know, the pieces from that golden age of Cartier in the, you know, the 20s and 30s are still, you know, tippy top. And that's an unassailable position. So that brand has a long way to go.
Gentlemen, with 2 minutes left here, I wanted to one final question to both of you. I'll start with you, Tom, if I can. If there was a handful of activities or practices or behavioral patterns that would assist you in becoming a connoisseur of the subject matter that we've been talking about today, sort of collectibles and high-end jewelry and certainly high-end timepieces. And I just listed down in my own mind what they would be. You know, it could be media influences. It could be individuals or brands worth following. It could be travel experiences. It could be an organization or a club or a community to join. It could be certain experiences that you have to experience. It could be social media. If you were to pick one that really stands out and says, this is where you should go to develop your credentials, to develop your skill in developing connoisseurship, where would you go? Where would you advise people to go or do?
I would advise people to find like-minded groups of people that, you know, collect or are connoisseurs for the same passion and same reasons they are. I think going to the vintage market is always a great place to, you know, understand history, to understand what's happening in auction, maybe understand some provenance. But I think there's a lot to be learned about the storytelling and history of a particular brand if you want to be a connoisseur of that brand.
James, same question.
I say read as much as you can. That's the place to start. There's so much information out there, and the more you read, the more comfort you'll feel in dealing with fellow collectors. And then you could look at the pieces, and when you see the details on the individual pieces, it rings a bell and it starts to click and hopefully generates its own level of inertia.
So I agree. Let's say I agree with you that I'm going to start reading. The first thing I would want to read, or the first place I would want to go to read, would be?
I'd say start doing searches on watches on the internet, or actually the best place for me is to find a good bookstore and buy yourself some thick books on the subject. There are plenty out there.
Bookstores still exist?
Yes.
I was kidding. Final question, James. What's the clock on your mantelpiece?
The clock, there's no clock on this mantelpiece, but downstairs I have an old Verge escapement clock with a chime, which I love very much. It's not signed.
And what's on your wrist right now?
I am currently wearing a Zenith chronograph.
And Tom, what's on your wrist right now?
I'm wearing an Apple Watch.
An Apple Watch. Gentlemen, it's been a delight to chat with both of you. We could spend another 5 hours here. And there's so much stuff I never covered, didn't get around to covering, but hopefully we got the gist of it. To our audience, I want to thank both James and Tom for a delightful conversation. And hopefully we've given you some starters, some starter dough to start the baking process for connoisseurship on timepieces and watches. I remind you again, don't send me an email. You're going to be getting a recording link this afternoon or tonight for the program, because I know you want to send it to friends and family, etc. And we'll do that later on today. And at exactly 11 a.m. Pacific, we are adjourned. We thank you for coming. And James and Tom, thank you for a delightful conversation. You are true gentlemen and you are true scholars. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.